The spring of 1945 brought neither joy nor hope to Germany's western borders. The land, once fragrant with fresh soil and blooming orchards, was now scarred by tank tracks and burned by fire. Along country roads moved weary columns of German soldiers, more like shadows than an army. Helmets lay abandoned on the roadsides, rifles discarded, maps torn to pieces. No one believed in victory anymore, and even the word defeat had lost its meaning. Only the dull expectation of the end remained. By early April, Germany's western defenses were collapsing everywhere. Advancing through the Rhine, American forces moved methodically, but without hatred. For most of them, this was no longer a war of destruction. It was the final stage of a long, exhausting campaign approaching its inevitable conclusion. In the villages where German units had recently stood, white flags began to appear, made from sheets, curtains, whatever could be found. The people no longer wanted to die. German soldiers who surrendered did so without resistance. They stacked their weapons with the same indifference with which they gazed at the gray sky. There was no malice in their eyes, only fatigue. Among them were young boys taken straight from schools, and older men recalled from rear duties. Each of them understood that it was over, yet none knew what awaited them next. The Americans entering German territory expected resistance, but often found silence instead. No gunfire, only the smell of smoke and the cracking of ice on rivers. The farm stood empty, though sometimes a face could be seen behind a window. A woman, an old man. They didn't look up or wave. They didn't beg. They simply waited for the foreign soldiers to pass. In parts of the Rhineland, brief skirmishes still flared, but more often entire German units surrendered together. On 9 April, American troops entered a small town called Witzenhausen. Among the ruins and half-burned barns, they found remnants of a battalion hiding in a granary. Those still able to walk were marched to a prisoner collection point. The rest were left under medical supervision. The Americans' faces showed no triumph. They were simply carrying out orders. The weather was damp and windy. The snow had melted, yet the air remained cold. Soldiers from both sides now trudged along the same muddy roads. The Germans no longer saw enemies, only men in different uniforms, living different fates. Many realized, perhaps for the first time, that the war had brought nothing but devastation. Around them lay ruined fields, dead horses, charred villages. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners trudged westward, not knowing where they were being taken, and almost none tried to escape. There was nowhere left to run. By late April, the world was slowly emerging from paralysis. Radio spoke of the coming end, but for those in Germany, the end did not feel like liberation. It was merely another kind of silence, heavy, stagnant, joyless. American officers recorded coordinates, counted prisoners, made reports. Everything happened with bureaucratic precision, as if these were not human lives, but logistical figures. Captured soldiers received minimal rations and were kept in temporary open-air camps. Some saw American supply convoys for the first time, trucks loaded with food and bread. The smell of it filled them with confusion. After months of starvation, it seemed unreal. Yet the food was not for them, and they knew it. They watched from a distance, without asking, without hoping. By the final days of April, the war was nearly over. On 30 April came the first rumors of Hitler's death, though few knew whether to believe them. On 7 May, the official announcement of Germany's surrender arrived. Those in the American zone received the news in silence. There was no joy, only relief, like the weary breath of a man who has survived a storm. That day, thousands of soldiers laid down their weapons and sat on the ground, staring into nothing. Peace came quietly. No parades, no anthems, only the sound of wind over the fields and the distant hum of trucks. For the German soldiers, the war had ended, but life had not. Ahead lay the camps, uncertainty, hunger, and perhaps a chance to see humanity again on the other side of the front line. None of them could have imagined that within weeks they would witness something they could scarcely believe, an act of simple kindness from American farmers who shared their food with those once called their enemies. After the official announcement of Germany's surrender, the remaining Wehrmacht units on the Western Front began to surrender en masse. Streams of soldiers moved along the roads leading to American collection points. They carried improvised white flags made from bandages, bedsheets, or torn clothing. Some supported wounded comrades on their shoulders. Others leaned on rifles that no longer served as weapons. The columns stretched for miles. Abandoned carts, shattered trucks, and torn uniforms littered the verges. It was the slow, exhausted movement of a nation surrendering without a fight. American units posted at crossroads directed the columns toward designated zones that had been turned into prisoner-of-war camps. The U.S. soldiers carried out their duties without hostility. For them, this was part of a vast logistical operation. Not vengeance, but administration. They understood that the men before them were not enemies anymore, but human beings who had lost everything. German officers silently handed over lists of their units, trying to preserve a sense of order. That order, symbolic though it was, helped them endure the feeling of total collapse. The march into captivity was long and grueling. The prisoners trudged through mud and broken roads for days on end. They rarely spoke. Some collapsed from exhaustion and were lifted briefly by their comrades before being left behind. Food ran out quickly. The Americans distributed meager rations, a little bread, canned beans, and water. For the starving men, it was almost salvation. For the first time in months, they ate without fear. Yet even hunger seemed dulled by despair. They kept walking because there was no other choice. By mid-May, the first large POW camps were established on the outskirts of towns in the American zone of occupation. These were open fields, surrounded by barbed wire, without proper shelters. When it rained, the ground turned into a swamp. The prisoners slept under the open sky, wrapped in coats or blankets. Despite the harshness, some semblance of order prevailed. Roll calls were held daily, rations were distributed, and guards tried to maintain calm. The Americans understood the scale of the situation. There were too many men and too few resources, and acted as efficiently as they could. The prisoners were in varying conditions. Some still maintained discipline, rising early, cleaning their boots, trying to appear soldierly. Others sat in silence, staring at the ground. The war had taken not only their homes, but also their sense of purpose. Among them were farmers, factory workers, teachers, doctors, people who had once lived ordinary lives. Now they were all the same, stripped of rank and certainty. That fragile equality before the unknown was both new and frightening. The American soldiers kept watch, but even they began to sense that the thousands of Germans before them were not an abstract enemy. They were tired men, just like themselves. Many of the Americans had been farmers before the war, and in the faces of the prisoners they saw reflections of their neighbors, brothers, and fathers. It was still too early for sympathy, but the first hints of understanding began to appear. By the end of May, when the camps had grown overcrowded, groups of prisoners were transferred deeper into the countryside, to large agricultural regions, where farm labor was urgently needed. These rural areas had escaped the worst of the destruction, and the soil remained fertile. There, among the fields and barns, the next chapter of their lives would begin, a chapter that would bring an encounter none of them could have imagined. The moment when former enemies would share food not as soldiers, but as human beings. By early June 1945, in the western part of Germany near the city of Kassel, the American military authorities established a new prisoner-of-war camp. It was located on the edge of a rural area, surrounded by fields of ripening wheat and corn, with a dark line of forest visible on the horizon. The location was chosen carefully. A railway branch ran nearby for supply deliveries, and several farms in the vicinity still had usable equipment. The war had not directly ravaged this region, yet its traces were everywhere: exhausted soil, fuel shortages, and abandoned farmhouses. Prisoners arrived in columns of several hundred men at a time. American guards oversaw them. But the atmosphere was relatively calm. Many Germans were surprised that they were not met with cruelty. They were given water, a little food, and permission to wash in the nearby river. After weeks of marching and open-air detention, this seemed almost luxurious. None of them knew how long they would remain there, but for the first time, fear was replaced by sheer exhaustion and a fragile sense of safety. The camp itself consisted of several large tracts of land fenced with barbed wire, dotted with makeshift shelters made of planks and canvas. Guard towers stood along the perimeter, though the guards showed no excessive strictness. The prisoners were divided into groups, each responsible for specific tasks: cleaning the grounds, collecting refuse, tending the kitchen, fetching water. The Americans recorded every man's name, issued numbered metal tags, and kept meticulous records. Everything was handled with bureaucratic precision, as though the camp were a logistical exercise rather than a congregation of human fates. The air above the camp smelled of damp soil and smoke from the fires the prisoners used for cooking. Accustomed to hunger, the Germans boiled weak infusions of grass, dried bread crusts, and saved every crumb. Their daily rations were meager: a few slices of bread, some potatoes, a spoonful of beans or cornmeal. The Americans themselves received better supplies, but rationed them carefully. Commanders knew that though the war was over, the supply system had yet to stabilize. Food still went first, to the active units and depots. Despite the hardship, a certain order took root within the camp. Former non-commissioned officers maintained discipline, appointed section leaders, and tried to prevent theft or violence. People clung to routine as to the last remnant of their former lives. Each evening after roll call, the camp fell into deep silence. The only sounds were the cries of owls beyond the fence and the creak of the gates. During those hours, the prisoners remembered their homes, their families, and the orchards and gardens that perhaps no longer existed. Occasionally, American farmers from nearby settlements came to the camp. They brought wagons of hay, tools, and sacks of grain. Some prisoners were taken out to help on local farms, clearing stones, mending fences, cutting grass. These work details, carried out under guard, became a form of salvation. Out in the open air, surrounded by the scent of earth, they felt momentarily human again. Labor gave them a sense of purpose, however faint. The farmers who saw them experienced conflicting feelings. Only months earlier, German soldiers had been the embodiment of the enemy. Now they stood before them as gaunt, weary men with lowered shoulders and hollow faces. Among the Americans were those who had lost relatives in the war, yet even they showed no hatred. The war itself seemed tired, drained of meaning. People simply wanted to return to life, to soil, to rhythm, to the ordinary cycle of work and harvest. By June, the heat grew oppressive. The prisoners built crude shades from sacks and boards to shield themselves from the burning sun. Water was scarce, though the river nearby provided some relief. At times, the guards allowed bathing in small groups under watch, but there were no escape attempts. Not because they feared punishment, there was simply nowhere to run. Germany lay in ruins, families scattered, towns destroyed. In the evenings, when the sunset painted the sky in red and amber, the camp would sink into sleep. A light mist rose from the fields and mixed with the smoke of the fires. In those moments, the line between prisoners and guards seemed to vanish. Both sides sat in silence, gazing at the horizon. The war had ended, yet it lingered in their minds. None of them knew that soon they would witness something extraordinary, an act of quiet humanity that would change the way they remembered this place. By the end of June 1945, the flow of German prisoners of war into the American zone continued to grow. The camps were overcrowded, and the military authorities decided to distribute part of the prisoners across agricultural regions where extra hands were urgently needed. The United States had begun a large-scale food production program for a devastated Europe, and farmers required labor to harvest their crops. The war had ended, but the fields did not wait. Wheat, corn, and oats demanded attention, or the work of millions would be lost. Those deemed fit for labor were transported deep into the countryside, to small towns scattered across the American Midwest. The journey was long, from ports to railway stations, then by trucks to isolated farms. The men who had once stood on battlefields now looked out the windows of military trains at endless plains, where the wind rippled through tall grass and the sun glinted off silos and white-painted barns. To them, America seemed like another planet, peaceful, orderly, untouched by destruction. Their first impressions were mixed. On one hand, they were struck by the scale and neatness of the American landscape, the vast open spaces, the smooth roads, the towns intact and prosperous. On the other, they felt a deep sense of humiliation. To work the soil of a former enemy was to face the ultimate symbol of defeat. They could not yet grasp how to exist in this new world, one defined not by fear and commands, but by the quiet rhythm of labor. American farmers received them without hostility. Military officers explained the rules. The prisoners would work under supervision, be housed in simple barracks on the farms, and receive food from local stores. Leaving the premises was forbidden, but otherwise treatment was fair. The workday began at sunrise and ended at sunset, after which they returned to their quarters. At first, the relationship between farmers and prisoners was cold and distant. The Germans worked in silence. The Americans watched cautiously. Yet as the days passed, a wordless understanding began to form between them. For the prisoners, labor on the land restored a faint echo of normal life. They once again held shovels, pitchforks, and sacks of grain. The soil beneath their feet felt familiar, the same smell of dust, sun, and sweat as in their own villages along the Rhine or in Bavaria. Many found an unexpected solace in the monotony of farm work. It offered rhythm, structure, and a reason to rise in the morning. They saw that the Americans worked with the same persistence that German farmers once had. Slowly, the sense of enmity began to fade. People began to recognize in one another the same exhaustion, the same desire simply to survive. Food remained modest, but was better than in the camps. The prisoners received bread, vegetables, and occasionally meat. The American farmers shared what they could spare, moved by the men's obvious hunger. For many Germans, it was the first time in months they had eaten enough to feel full. This simple act left a lasting impression. They could not comprehend why former enemies treated them with such quiet decency. Sometimes, after supper, the farmers would leave leftovers, pieces of bread, apples, potatoes, near the barns where the prisoners slept. The Germans interpreted these small gestures as something more than charity. They were signs of a world returning to reason, of a humanity surviving beneath the uniform. Having been taught by war to expect hatred and punishment, they did not know how to react to kindness. They ate quietly, avoiding each other's eyes, as though afraid that a single word might destroy the fragile peace of that moment. The American soldiers assigned to guard the farms noticed these changes. They watched as, day by day, the distance between the two groups seemed to shrink. Men who months earlier had fought each other now worked side by side, bound not by politics, but by labor and necessity. There were no speeches, no reconciliation ceremonies, only the simple, unspoken recognition that the war was truly over. Before long, American units began sending surplus food supplies, flour, cornmeal, dried fruit, sugar to the rural camps. Part of these shipments reached the German workers. No one expected gratitude. It was an act born not of pity, but of understanding. The hungry were no longer the enemy. And it was there, among the quiet fields and dusty roads, that a different kind of history began, one not written by orders or battles, but by simple, human acts of compassion. July 1945 was hot and dry. Across the American Midwest, heavy, nearly ripe fields of grain swayed in the wind. German prisoners of war, assigned to help with the harvest, worked from early morning until late evening. Their movements were slow and measured, saving their strength. The sun burned their skin, their hands were covered with blisters, yet in the rhythm of labor there was something familiar. The earth, the scent of cut grass, and the rustle of wheat returned them to what they once knew best, work that required no weapons. The American farmers watched without comment. They understood that before them were men who had lived through disaster. Many of the prisoners had been farmers themselves, and in their gestures one could see the precise care of those who know the land. They did not complain or bargain. They simply worked. When the day ended and the sun sank below the horizon, the prisoners were assembled near the barns and marched back to their quarters under guard. One evening, after a long day in the fields, something happened that many would later remember as a turning point. The farmer who owned one of the nearby farms left several baskets of food beside the barn. Leftover bread, corn cakes, a few vegetables. He had not done it by order, nor as a display of generosity. He simply did not want to throw food away, knowing that the men who worked his fields were hungry. The guards noticed, but said nothing. When the prisoners returned, the baskets were already waiting at the entrance. No one gave permission, yet no one forbade them either. For a long time, the Germans stared at the food, unwilling to believe it was meant for them. Years of war had taught them distrust. Every unexpected act of kindness could hide a trap. But hunger was stronger than fear. One man stepped forward and took a piece of bread, then another followed. Soon the baskets were empty. They ate in silence, cautiously, as if afraid that a word or sound might end this strange, fragile reality in which the enemy left them food and demanded nothing in return. The Americans who had witnessed this saw it as a simple, practical gesture, nothing more than sharing leftovers. But for the prisoners, it was something extraordinary. They had expected contempt and punishment, not this quiet indifference to the boundaries of war. The act carried no speeches or symbols, yet it spoke louder than either. It meant that the conflict had truly ended, at least in this place. In the days that followed, similar moments began to occur elsewhere. On some farms, after meals, the Americans left portions of vegetables or milk. Sometimes the prisoners were even allowed to eat together with the workers. Everything happened quietly, without discussion or sentiment. People simply shared food. Slowly, the invisible wall between captors and captives began to fade. The war, that immense force that had divided them, now seemed like a distant echo. These scenes left a mark on all who witnessed them. No one issued orders to act this way. No records were kept. Yet in that unspoken exchange of bread, something larger was born, a recognition that humanity had survived the war. The American soil, warm and fragrant with grain, became a place where enemies ceased to be enemies. For the German prisoners, that evening with the baskets of bread remained etched in memory. They had seen death, hunger, and ruin. They had learned to expect only cruelty. To find compassion where they least expected it was almost incomprehensible. None of them spoke about gratitude. The feeling was too complex for words. but all carried within them the same quiet certainty that this simple act had restored something lost long before. The war had ended on the maps weeks earlier, but there, among the fields of wheat and the silence of a summer evening, it ended in their hearts as well. August 1945 brought heat and stillness. On the American farms, the harvest was nearly complete, and work began to slow. The German prisoners of war continued their labor, gathering the last sheaves of wheat and stacking hay under the fading summer sun. The days were shorter now, and the air held a chill in the mornings. Amid this calm, peaceful routine, the past did not vanish. It lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. Many of the prisoners lived inside their memories. They remembered ruined cities, fallen comrades, the hunger and frost of previous winters. Each man carried his own private burden of guilt and exhaustion. Among them were former officers, peasants, teachers, and factory workers, people who had once led ordinary lives before the war had torn them away from everything familiar. Now, stripped of rank and certainty, they were forced to face what they had long avoided: reflection. The past trailed them silently, as something that could not be escaped. The American landscape, peaceful and whole, contrasted sharply with their recollections. Everything here seemed untouched: cultivated fields, standing houses, undamaged roads. To the Germans, it was both astonishing and painful. They admired the order and abundance, yet it reminded them of what their own homeland had lost. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they often stood motionless at the edges of the fields, staring into the distance, imagining what their homes might look like now if they still existed at all. The American farmers did not ask questions. They saw only men doing their work. Silence became their form of communication. Sometimes a glance betrayed a flicker of compassion, but words were unnecessary. The quiet kept a fragile balance. None of them wanted to return to the subject of war. It was present without being spoken in scars, in posture, in the slow, cautious movements of hands. Despite the outer calm, many prisoners were haunted at night by dreams of the front. Some woke at phantom gunfire. Others saw the faces of the dead. The war lived inside them, like a sickness that could not be cured. Even among the wide, golden fields of America, they could not feel free. Captivity was no longer in the barbed wire. It was in their minds. The Americans treated them without cruelty. For the farmers, the war was over. The soil demanded attention, not vengeance. They needed to sow, to harvest, to prepare for winter. For the Germans, each passing day on this peaceful land was both a reminder of defeat and a lesson in survival. Slowly, they began to understand that peace is not built on victories, but on the capacity to forgive, even silently, even without words. By late August, the season's work was ending. The prisoners remained on the farms, waiting for orders about their future. Some dreamed of returning home. Others feared there was no home to return to. In the evenings, they sat outside the barracks, watching the sunset. The fading light mirrored their thoughts, the weight of memory, and the fragile hope that somewhere beyond the ocean, among the ruins, life was beginning again. America had given them food and work, but also something deeper: the faint, stubborn belief that humanity could outlive war. Autumn 1945 brought the first cold winds. The fields that had been golden and full in summer now lay bare. On the American farms, the last of the harvest was finished, and work slowed to a halt. Among the German prisoners, talk began to spread of repatriation, the long-awaited return home. The war was over, but its weight still hung heavily in every mind. American authorities had started the gradual release of prisoners not suspected of war crimes. For thousands of German soldiers, the moment approached that they had both longed for and feared: the journey back. The first repatriation lists appeared in September. The names were read out slowly and formally, each one marking a separate life, fragile and uncertain. Those included packed what little they had, scraps of letters, makeshift bags, small belongings they had managed to keep. Ahead lay weeks of travel across the ocean and the wrecked roads of Europe. For many, it was a road leading into the unknown. The Americans prepared the transports with their usual efficiency. Before departure, prisoners underwent medical checks and were given dry rations, bread, canned meat, water. Yet few felt relief. They had been captives for so long that freedom seemed unreal. Thoughts of home filled them with both hope and dread. Germany was in ruins. Families scattered. Cities burned. For some, the word home had become a memory rather than a destination. Farmers who had employed the prisoners came to see them off. The farewells were quiet. No words were exchanged, only brief nods or glances. Both sides understood that this was more than a formal goodbye. The Americans knew these men had lost everything. The Germans knew they had been shown a humanity they could not have expected. In that silent moment of parting, there was a kind of respect, the simplest kind, born of shared labor and endurance. The road home was long. Prisoners traveled in crowded trains to the ports where ships waited to take them across the Atlantic. The sea was rough in autumn, and the voyage slow. Men slept on the decks wrapped in blankets, eating from the modest ship's rations. The constant sound of the waves filled the nights. They spoke little. There was nothing left to say. Most thought not of the war behind them, but of the uncertain future waiting beyond the gray horizon. When the ships finally reached Europe, the sight was desolate. Bombed ports, burned-out warehouses, and makeshift camps lined the shore. Smoke still rose from heaps of rubble. The men were unloaded, registered, and divided among the occupation zones. Many did not go home immediately. They waited weeks in temporary holding areas, surrounded by ruins. The silence there was heavy, as if the continent itself had not yet decided how to begin again. Those who did reach their towns and villages found little resembling the places they had left. Houses lay in fragments. Families were gone. Some learned that their parents or children had died, others that strangers now lived in their homes. Yet, despite the emptiness, the return mattered. It closed a circle that had begun months earlier on foreign soil, when American farmers had shared food with men who once would have called them enemies. Standing among the wreckage, many of the returning soldiers remembered that moment, the baskets of bread, the quiet acceptance, the realization that kindness could exist even after everything. That memory became a symbol stronger than defeat. It reminded them that dignity could survive even when a nation could not. They no longer believed in grand causes or slogans. What they wanted was peace, silence, and the simple right to till the earth again. By the end of 1945, most of the surviving prisoners had been returned to Europe. Some disappeared into ordinary life. Others stayed abroad, unwilling to revisit the ruins. But all carried the same memory of that strange summer on the American farms, of how, in the aftermath of destruction, a loaf of bread had become a gesture of reconciliation. It was not a story about victory or forgiveness, but about the return of humanity itself, a quiet reminder that even after the darkest years, a man could still choose decency. Autumn 1945 brought the first cold winds. The fields that had been golden and full in summer now lay bare. On the American farms, the last of the harvest was finished, and work slowed to a halt. Among the German prisoners, talk began to spread of repatriation, the long-awaited return home. The war was over, but its weight still hung heavily in every mind. American authorities had started the gradual release of prisoners not suspected of war crimes. For thousands of German soldiers, the moment approached that they had both longed for and feared the journey back. The first repatriation lists appeared in September. The names were read out slowly and formally, each one marking a separate life, fragile and uncertain. Those included packed what little they had, scraps of letters, makeshift bags, small belongings they had managed to keep. Ahead lay weeks of travel across the ocean and the wrecked roads of Europe. For many, it was a road leading into the unknown. The Americans prepared the transports with their usual efficiency. Before departure, prisoners underwent medical checks and were given dry rations, bread, canned meat, water. Yet few felt relief. They had been captives for so long that freedom seemed unreal. Thoughts of home filled them with both hope and dread. Germany was in ruins, families scattered, cities burned. For some, the word home had become a memory rather than a destination. Farmers who had employed the prisoners came to see them off. The farewells were quiet. No words were exchanged, only brief nods or glances. Both sides understood that this was more than a formal goodbye. The Americans knew these men had lost everything. The Germans knew they had been shown a humanity they could not have expected. In that silent moment of parting, there was a kind of respect, the simplest kind, born of shared labor and endurance. The road home was long. Prisoners traveled in crowded trains to the ports, where ships waited to take them across the Atlantic. The sea was rough in autumn, and the voyage slow. Men slept on the decks wrapped in blankets, eating from the modest ship's rations. The constant sound of the waves filled the nights. They spoke little. There was nothing left to say. Most thought not of the war behind them, but of the uncertain future waiting beyond the gray horizon. When the ships finally reached Europe, the sight was desolate. Bombed ports, burned-out warehouses, and makeshift camps lined the shore. Smoke still rose from heaps of rubble. The men were unloaded, registered, and divided among the occupation zones. Many did not go home immediately. They waited weeks in temporary holding areas, surrounded by ruins. The silence there was heavy, as if the continent itself had not yet decided how to begin again. Those who did reach their towns and villages found little resembling the places they had left. Houses lay in fragments. Families were gone. Some learned that their parents or children had died, others that strangers now lived in their homes. Yet despite the emptiness, the return mattered. It closed a circle that had begun months earlier on foreign soil, when American farmers had shared food with men who once would have called them enemies. Standing among the wreckage, many of the returning soldiers remembered that moment, the baskets of bread, the quiet acceptance, the realization that kindness could exist even after everything. That memory became a symbol stronger than defeat. It reminded them that dignity could survive even when a nation could not. They no longer believed in grand causes or slogans. What they wanted was peace, silence, and the simple right to till the earth again. By the end of 1945, most of the surviving prisoners had been returned to Europe. Some disappeared into ordinary life. Others stayed abroad, unwilling to revisit the ruins. But all carried the same memory of that strange summer on the American farms, of how, in the aftermath of destruction, a loaf of bread had become a gesture of reconciliation. It was not a story about victory or forgiveness, but about the return of humanity itself. A quiet reminder that even after the darkest years, a man could still choose decency.